It's another case. Let us hope that they will not do it. This is a piece of land that belongs to Somalia, and Somalia will never yield whatever pressure that comes on it.
Has banned ports operator DP World from operating in Somaliland. The government argues that a contract the company signed last year with Somaliland to develop an economic zone is null and void. DP World said last week it had signed a final agreement with Somaliland to develop the zone and expected to break ground in the 12-square-kilometer project later this year.
Boom. Somalia just took control of its imports. Mogadishu, Bosaso, and Berbera ports are now under ECTN control, and this gives Somalia 5 huge economic benefits.
Washington never thought Somalia would walk away, and the port deal was supposed to be permanent, strategic, untouchable, then Somalia canceled it. Not in chaos, not in anger, but with planning, confidence, and alternatives already in place. Control returned to Somali hands. Decisions moved home.
Now, Somali ports and border territory play a significant role in East Africa's trade, serving as a vital gateway for landlocked countries to access global markets and facilitate regional trade. Somalia's strategic location on the Indian Ocean and Red Sea makes it a key link for trade with the East African community and beyond.
And suddenly, America's foothold in one of the world's most strategic maritime regions began to disappear. This wasn't just about a port. It was about power. Because when a country proves it can cancel a deal with the United States and still move forward, every old assumption collapses. And that's why Washington isn't angry. It's worried. For years, the port deal between Somalia and the United States was presented as a symbol of partnership. It promised modernization, security cooperation, and economic integration into global shipping lanes. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it became a source of growing unease inside Somalia, unease that eventually turned into resolve. The cancellation did not happen overnight. Somalia had entered the agreement at a moment of vulnerability. Infrastructure gaps were wide, investment options were limited, stability was fragile. The port deal offered immediate relief, but it came with long-term commitments that increasingly felt misaligned with Somalia's evolving priorities. As regional trade intensified, Somalia's ports gained new strategic importance. Shipping routes shifted, Red Sea traffic increased, Gulf of Aden logistics became more valuable. With this shift came leverage Somalia had not fully understood when the deal was signed. The United States, however, treated the agreement as settled. Operational control expanded gradually, security protocols tightened, commercial flexibility narrowed. Somali authorities began noticing that decision-making power was drifting away from local institutions. Revenues flowed, but influence flowed outward. Somalia started asking questions. Why were port expansion decisions delayed without external approval? Why were regional trade partnerships constrained by clauses written far from the Horn of Africa? Why did security cooperation increasingly resemble oversight rather than support? These questions circulated quietly at first. Internal reviews revealed structural imbalances. While the United States gained strategic access and operational certainty, Somalia absorbed political risk, public scrutiny, and opportunity cost. Alternative partners were expressing interest, but existing terms limited flexibility. Somalia recognized a familiar pattern. The deal had secured presence, not partnership. As regional neighbors upgraded infrastructure and diversified alliances, Somalia felt increasingly boxed in. Its ports were becoming gateways for others, but Somalia itself lacked control over how those gateways were used. The decision to cancel was framed carefully. Publicly, Somalia cited sovereignty, economic alignment, and national development goals. Privately, the reasoning went deeper. The port deal had locked Somalia into a framework designed for external priorities rather than regional integration. Washington reacted with concern. The United States understood ports not merely as commercial assets, but as strategic nodes. Losing access meant losing visibility, influence, and logistical advantage in a region growing more competitive by the year. Somalia understood this too. That understanding shaped its timing. Rather than abrupt termination, Somalia initiated a structured withdrawal. Legal reviews were completed, compensation mechanisms were evaluated, international observers were briefed. The process was methodical, signaling seriousness rather than impulse. This approach unsettled Washington more than confrontation would have. There was no crisis to manage, no emergency to exploit, no leverage to apply quickly. Somalia's calm execution suggested preparation, and preparation implied alternatives. Those alternatives worried Washington. Regional partners expressed readiness to invest, infrastructure financing proposals appeared, trade corridors were discussed openly. Somalia's ports, once seen as dependent on American backing, were suddenly positioned as competitive assets in a multipolar environment. The United States attempted to renegotiate proposals emphasized security cooperation and economic incentives. Somalia listened but remained firm. The issue was no longer terms, it was direction. Somalia had reached a conclusion. Development anchored in external control was not development at all. The cancellation sent ripples through diplomatic channels. American strategists worried about precedent. If Somalia could unwind such a deal, others might follow. Port access across the region could become contested. Strategic assumptions would need revision. Somalia was aware of these implications. But the choice was framed domestically as necessary rather than bold. Control over ports meant control over trade policy, revenue allocation, and long-term planning. Without that control, sovereignty remained incomplete. As the cancellation proceeded, Somali public sentiment shifted. The decision resonated with a broader desire for self-determination. Infrastructure was no longer seen as neutral, it was understood as power. Washington's concern deepened as timelines advanced. The United States faced the prospect of reduced presence in a region where competition was intensifying. Maritime routes, energy flows, and security dynamics all intersected near Somalia's coastline. The cancellation threatened to alter that balance. Somalia maintained diplomatic restraint, statements avoided accusation, language emphasized mutual respect, the narrative focused on future alignment rather than past grievance. This discipline made it harder for Washington to frame the move as hostility. Instead, it appeared as independence. The port deal's end marked a shift in Somalia's posture. No longer content to be a passive host, Somalia positioned itself as an active manager of its strategic assets. For Washington, this was the unsettling part. The worry was not the loss of a single port agreement. It was the signal that Somalia now believed it had options, and that belief was contagious as the cancellation moved toward completion. Global observers took note. Somalia's decision challenged assumptions about leverage, dependency, and control. It suggested that even agreements rooted in security could be re-examined through the lens of sovereignty. Washington began recalculating. The Horn of Africa was no longer a space of predictable influence. It was becoming a zone of negotiation, competition, and choice. And Somalia, once seen as peripheral, had placed itself firmly at the center of that shift. This was only the first consequence. The deeper effects were still unfolding. As Somalia's cancellation of the port deal moved from decision to execution, the wider implications began to crystallize. What had initially unsettled Washington as a diplomatic inconvenience soon revealed itself as a strategic recalibration with long-term consequences. The first realization inside the United States was that Somalia had acted from a position of growing confidence, not desperation. This alone altered the tone of concern. Somalia was no longer negotiating for survival, it was negotiating for advantage. The Horn of Africa had changed. Trade volumes through nearby corridors were increasing. Regional infrastructure projects were accelerating. Maritime traffic through the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden continued to intensify. Somalia's coastline, once viewed primarily through a security lens, had become an economic artery. Washington understood that losing preferential port access meant more than logistical inconvenience. It meant diminished influence over emerging trade flows and reduced visibility in a region where strategic competition was sharpening. Somalia anticipated this reaction. Rather than retreating into isolation, Somalia actively communicated with multiple partners. Investment forums were convened, port modernization plans were revised under Somali control, financing proposals were evaluated on commercial viability rather than geopolitical alignment. This openness sent a clear signal: Somalia was not closing doors, it was choosing who held the keys. Washington attempted to frame the cancellation as a temporary divergence. Diplomatic language emphasized continuity of cooperation in other areas, but internally, assessments acknowledged that Somalia's decision reflected a deeper shift toward strategic autonomy. The concern grew: if Somalia could successfully manage port operations independently or through diversified partnerships, the rationale for exclusive access elsewhere weakened. Control was no longer justified as stability. It risked being perceived as constraint. Somalia's approach reinforced this perception. Operational authority over ports returned to national institutions. Revenue streams were restructured. Local employment increased. Regulatory oversight strengthened. Each step demonstrated capacity rather than vulnerability. These developments made reversal unlikely. Washington explored alternative engagement strategies, including broader regional cooperation, yet Somalia's ports had unique geographic value. No substitute offered equivalent reach or flexibility. The cancellation also altered regional perceptions. Neighboring countries observed Somalia's assertiveness with interest. For years, external security arrangements had shaped port governance across the region. Somalia's move suggested a different model was possible, one balancing security cooperation with economic sovereignty. This possibility unsettled established assumptions. Somalia's confidence was reinforced by early outcomes. Shipping efficiency improved as decision-making accelerated. Fees were adjusted to attract diverse carriers. Port revenues stabilized under national control. These gains, while modest initially, validated the strategy. Washington took note. The concern shifted from immediate loss to long-term influence. Strategic access is rarely reclaimed once normalized absence sets in. Somalia's calm execution suggested permanence. The United States also recognized the symbolic dimension. Ports represent gateways not only for goods but for power. Control over access shapes narratives of authority. Somalia's decision challenged the idea that security partnerships justified indefinite operational control. This challenge resonated globally. Analysts began citing Somalia as an example of recalibrated sovereignty. Discussions emerged about balancing partnership with autonomy. The cancellation became less about Somalia specifically and more about a broader trend among emerging economies. Washington's worry deepened accordingly. The issue was no longer a bilateral disagreement. It was a signal that traditional leverage tools were losing effectiveness. Security guarantees alone could not secure compliance. Economic alignment and respect for autonomy were becoming decisive. Somalia remained disciplined in its messaging. Official statements avoided triumphalism. The narrative focused on national development and regional integration. This restraint limited diplomatic fallout while reinforcing legitimacy. The absence of hostility complicated Washington's response. Without provocation, retaliation lacked justification. Without crisis, urgency faded. Somalia's steady progression normalized the new reality. Over time, the cancellation reshaped operational patterns. Shipping companies adjusted routes. Security coordination continued through multilateral frameworks rather than exclusive arrangements. Somalia's ports integrated into regional networks on Somali terms. Washington adapted reluctantly. The United States recalibrated expectations, investing in alternative partnerships while maintaining dialogue with Somalia. Yet the loss of direct control remained a strategic setback. Somalia's posture continued evolving. With ports under national oversight, Somalia aligned infrastructure planning with domestic priorities. Industrial zones were mapped, logistics corridors were coordinated with neighbors, port revenue supported broader development goals. These integrations reinforced autonomy. Somalia no longer viewed ports as isolated assets. They became central to economic strategy. This holistic approach contrasted sharply with earlier arrangements focused narrowly on access and security. The difference mattered. Washington's worry stemmed not only from exclusion, but from Somalia's success. A failed cancellation would have reinforced dependency narratives. A functioning one undermined them. As time passed, the cancellation ceased to be controversial. It became precedent. Other countries referenced Somalia's experience when reviewing their own agreements. Questions emerged about control, flexibility, and long-term alignment. Somalia's decision had quietly expanded the range of acceptable choices. For Washington, this was the most troubling outcome. Influence relies on predictability. Somalia had introduced uncertainty not through instability, but through agency. Somalia had not rejected partnership. It had redefined it. The port deal's cancellation marked a turning point in how strategic assets were governed. Control was no longer assumed to follow power, it followed consent, and as Somalia demonstrated that consent could be withdrawn methodically and successfully, Washington understood the deeper implication. The world was changing, access would no longer be inherited, it would be negotiated, and in that new reality, Somalia had made itself impossible to ignore.